And then the sort of product element of it, is it the right product, isn't it? What's the customer looking for? Where's the gap in the market? Can you still make money from it? Who's making margin where? What happens if the supply chain doesn't work? Do you want to go direct? So all these real pertinent questions. And then at the end of that long road, then you hit promotion.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Bang for Your Business with me, James Burnett, and Lucas Hamby. Lucas, hi, how are you?
Hello, James.
You all right?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, very well, thank you. Today, our guest is Head of Marketing Europe for Financial Services Group, OFX, Richard Levy. Richard, hello.
Hi, James. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Can we start today with you telling us a little bit about the business, its history, and who your typical customer is?
Yeah, we've got an interesting history, James, actually, because we started only in 1998, which makes us a relatively young company at 22 years. And we started in a place you probably know quite well, the beaches of Sydney, where a guy who was working for an investment bank at the time set up OFX and said, you know, it was going to be something where he just felt, it was actually a guy called Matthew Gilmore, and he set up a website in the year 2000. And it's easy in a way, James, to look back now and think, well, everyone has a website. But in the year 2000, some 20 years ago, a bit of a sort of brave move. And he was an investment banker, and he left his job because he felt there was a better way or a different way or a fairer way to do stuff. And in 2001, the company sort of launched its first money transfer facility. So we're relatively young, as I say, starting in Sydney. And we're now, we have offices in a few places across the world, but London is obviously where I am. And we're still headquartered out of Sydney. And I think the ethos that Matthew had, which was of sort of fairness and very much a sort of people side of things, still transmits its way through the company. So we tend to serve small and medium-sized enterprises who trade abroad, and also consumers who may need to send money overseas. Where we're a little bit unique is that we don't have any retail premises as such, but we have a human and digital side. So the human is that you could contact us 24/7, 365 days a year. So at any point you could give us a call and someone will speak to you and have a chat. But equally, you could go onto our website and do your whole transaction pretty much digitally if you wanted to. So I think what's really interesting, James, is that if you look at it from a company point of view, as is the tendency for many businesses, it's very much a sort of swift move to digitalization, and everything is digital, and everything is moving in that direction. And the unique point about OFX is that if you want to do most things digitally, you can, and we have a really good online platform. But actually, if at 3 a.m. you wake up and you just want to have a chat to someone, or at 7 p.m. you're sitting there and think, I need to hear a human voice, then you're able to do so. And I think probably more so in these times than any others, you know, the ability to speak to people is huge. And I think we're trying to reverse it a bit and say, what does the customer want to do? So however they want to transact with us, they can. I think that's good.
So you're listening and you're adapting to the needs of your customer. So just how does that work? Where you say you mentioned you're based in London, head office is in Sydney. How does that work with your meetings with people down under?
Well, it basically means quite a few early mornings and quite a few late nights. Quite frankly, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because if you go back 10 years ago, and you can expand this out a little bit to the present situation we're in, with many people suddenly, you know, working from home, etc. If your main office had been on the other side of the world, I think you'd have had enormous challenges. Now you jump on a call, you're connected within a matter of seconds, and you speak to the person at the other end. So to be honest, location-wise, if you exclude the time zone difference, which makes it always a little bit more interesting, it's no real different to, you know, my previous job at MoneyGram. We were headquartered in Dallas. So you jump on a call and you'd speak to someone in the US, and they used to come on about 2 p.m. our time in the afternoon. So it's fine. But I do think, you know, if you look at the changes in the world in the last 10 or 15 years, connectivity would be up there, globalization would be up there. So certainly in the last, it's a good question actually that you haven't asked, but I'm going to answer it anyway. In the last 5 or 6 years, I don't think I've reported to anyone in the UK. I mean, I think it has literally been people in either European country or the US or now Australia. So it's perhaps more normal than we think.
But obviously having a boss overseas as you have now and previously, that is a challenge and comes with its own, you need to work on those relationships a little bit more. Now they're remote. I suppose other people are doing that now because they're not seeing their bosses on a regular basis, but that needs consideration and work, doesn't it?
It's probably something you're more used to now anyway, seeing as, working abroad over in Australia and with those guys there, having that connectivity with them over mediums such as Zoom like this and video calls, video meetings, it's probably something you're slightly more used to.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at MoneyGram, which was the company before OFX, as I said, I used to sort of work for, my boss was based in Dallas, and so consequently you became used to it. The first time you do it, it's different because you may have a one-to-one once a week, but what they're not there for is that sort of day-to-day corridor chat, water cooler moment where you just sort of want to run something by them. So what you actually do is it makes you much more selective in your communication. So when you start work, you're told, when you meet with your boss, only really tell them the most important things for them and keep it really sort of relevant. And when you are face to face, that can slip. But I think that when you have a boss who is not in the same country as you and you're connecting maybe one-on-one for half an hour a week, 45 minutes a week, maybe less, right? Maybe every other week, maybe once a month, depending on your situation, then you make sure that you don't waste that hour, right? That hour becomes relatively precious. So it's then what are the most important things for you, but equally, what are the most important things for them? And the third aspect is what are the most important things for them to know? Because actually you don't sit there and say, oh, I've done this and I've done that. You say, here are the 4 things I want to cover because these are the most pertinent things. So it can be, I think it's like any relationship, right? It takes time and it takes trust on both sides and it takes willingness on both sides. But I would put it out there that it's definitely the way the world is going. And even now, if you're based in the same country, perhaps with trends to work from home a little bit more than people have done in the past, even if you were based in London and your boss was, if you're not physically together, it's still going to need, it's an interesting area of how that relationship will change as time goes on because. Yeah.
Seems like good practice as well, because James and I have spoken about this a few times where, people have meetings for the sake of meetings and they're not productive. Yeah. It's almost like, as I said, for the sake of it. With that time you've got, you can be so concise and so to the point that it's probably, really, really productive.
You know what's really interesting, Lucas, about that point is that in a lot of business, I'm just talking about generally, people need, if you want to travel from the UK to, say, Italy, for argument's sake, you have to go through a sign-off process and you get it cleared and they can only spend this amount in a hotel and in a restaurant and where you're going to go and there's the P&E budget. That applies pretty much globally. When people come to meetings, you have a 2-hour meeting, add up the salary, roughly, of everyone in that meeting and say, okay, this meeting has cost us, say, £5,000, for argument's sake. Did we get £5,000 worth of value out of it? People are much more laid back about that kind of stuff. I actually think it's because they're not really thinking in those terms. But I know I was reading an article the other day about Amazon, and they were saying that no meeting should be more than 30 minutes. There's an empty chair in every meeting for where the customer would be sitting, which makes you rather sort of customer focused. And no meeting can happen without the person organising it, sending out notes beforehand for everyone to read. So that gets the person who's arranged the meeting very focused on what am I trying to achieve. It makes sure you don't waste 15 minutes going over the purpose of the meeting. And when you only have half an hour, unless you say, I actually want to extend it and actually make a big thing of it and everyone's got to agree to that, makes you very, very focused. So it's a really good point about meetings. It's probably you could have an hour conversation about meetings, right? But it's an interesting one because of, are they run particularly effectively and efficiently? I would argue in most cases, probably not.
So how did you get into the financial services industry? I mean, and how hard is it marketing within this space? It's definitely seems more challenging.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Lucas. And I would love to sit here with you and James and say I had this beautiful career plan when I left university at 21 and everything has sort of been ticked off, but it was nothing of the sort. When I left university a few years ago now, as you can imagine, there was the milk round where you would talk to a number of companies and hope to get a placement, and they were highly competitive. There were probably 2,000 people going for 6 or 8 graduate places. And I was talking to, I'd studied business administration, which has an advantage that it gives you quite a lot of sort of skills across the board. The disadvantage is that it doesn't narrow it down. So, if you go to university and you study law, probably going to become a lawyer, you study finance, you may go into accountancy. Business is very wide. So marketing actually had been part of the syllabus, which I'd enjoyed. But nevertheless, I was talking to a number of businesses, really wide-ranging, from GlaxoSmithKline to Ford, and then Abbey National, which is now Santander, for those with long enough memories of that brand. We're doing a marketing graduate scheme based in Milton Keynes, actually, which is 50 miles roughly north of London. And I managed to get a place on that marketing scheme. And it was really either marketing or sales or finance or IT. And probably that business degree gives you a little bit of freedom where sort of marketing could fit into it. So I can't say, Lucas, that I sort of sat there at 21 and thought I'm going to be a financial services marketeer. So you sort of fall into it rather fortuitously. And then it was a case of actually quite enjoying financial services, because I do think it's one of those rare topics that almost cover each and every one of us. So whether you have children, you don't have children, whether you live alone or you're part of a vast family, it doesn't matter. Your personal financial situation is pretty important. And actually, what I have noticed as the years have gone on is that financial literacy, certainly in the UK, is actually relatively low. People, always amazes me, but the people obsessed with how much they earn. And yet when you actually say, what are you doing with the money that you have? A lot of people don't really look at that in particularly detailed way, right? Or knowledgeable way. So financial services seem to me an interesting one. And when you go into a graduate scheme, you spent 6 months, it was a long time ago, right, in Swiss Cottage, in a branch, doing everything from being a cashier to a meter greeter. And that's the most valuable 6 months in hindsight you'll ever have, because that gives you face-to-face contact with customers every single day. So there's always this, sort of head office against the sort of people actually on the front line, and actually spending 6 months there, you actually see the reality of it. And if you can keep that with you as long as you can. I noticed the other day that the new the new CEO of John Lewis and Waitrose was in the Waitrose branch stacking shelves on the Holloway Road. And their point was it just gave you actual interface time with the customer. So that 6 months was important. And then I spent another 6 months in savings, in unsecured personal loans, in unsecured personal loans, and then I went into advertising and then savings. So it gave you this whole interest in how financial services worked, how a big business worked. And that was the biggest advice. I had to give advice to anyone who's leaving university and you haven't really had a job before other than a paper boy or worked in, a local news agent. So suddenly you join this corporate giant, as Abbey was at the time, and now Santander. And there's a way they do things, and there's a way to talk, and there's a way to behave, and there's a way to think about things that it actually takes a lot of, I found, a lot of getting used to. So the whole corporate world for me was quite a confusing place for those first couple of years, because it was just so what I wasn't used to. And I think marketing is a really interesting one, because to my previous point that if you study law, you become a lawyer, you study maths, you become an accountant. But actually, of the 6 graduates that were in my year, I don't think any of us, I may stand corrected, it was a while ago, but certainly the majority, if not all of us, hadn't studied marketing. And I think that's a real letdown for the industry, that there's still a lot of people, I think, still coming into marketing who are not necessarily trained in it. And that then leads to, that famous quote of, well, everyone thinks they're a marketeer. Well, perhaps, if people were better trained in the subject and had been through academic programs and really understood it, you'd realize that actually very few people are successful marketeers, right? So it's an industry which I think has quite a way to go in really pushing the academic side of it and saying people should study it, because it leaves itself open otherwise to people thinking it's the sort of just a sort of creative and common sense, and I would argue it's neither. So anyway, that's quite a long answer to your question of how I became a sort of financial services marketeer, but probably by good fortune. And then when I understood marketing more and really took time out to study it, the history of it, the best practices, and you looked at businesses like P&G and Unilever, the real top marketing brands in the world. They're not the top marketing brands by accident. There's a real science behind it, and so that appealed as well.
Just on that point, sorry, what would you say does make a successful marketeer within this industry?
Well, I think if you, there's three things I think a marketer needs to be able to do. The first is diagnosis of what does that market look like externally and internally. And I think that's quite a technical thing to do. And it's not, marketing is not an exact science. So, you know, if you look at medicine, for example, it's a little bit more exact chemistry. Marketing isn't, but diagnosis, that should then lead on to, okay, this is the market, what's our strategy? Strategy, probably the most misunderstood business term in the last 100 years, but strategy very much for me is about simplification and making hard choices. Strategy very much is also about what you don't do as much as what you do, and that can be a tough choice. You've got diagnosis, strategy, and then finally the tactics. What marketing has lost its way perhaps as an industry in the last 30 years is that it's become a little bit over-reliant on the tactics and the communication side. So if you speak to most people, they say I'm in marketing and they will want to talk to you about adverts and communication. And actually, if you really break marketing down, the communication side should be about 8% of it, right? So 92% of your job, nothing to do with communication. That's just the final piece of the jigsaw. There's, you know, there's the segmentation, there's the targeting, there's the positioning, there's the diagnosis of the brand, the history of the brand. How can you separate yourselves? Are you going after a mass market? Are you going after a short-term market? What's the distribution like? How do you manage your costs? Even if you look at the technical element of marketing historically, and I don't think it's ever been more relevant as it is today, you've got pricing, place, promotion, and product. And there's a reason that traditionally promotion is at the end. But, you know, how many marketeers are now involved in pricing? How many marketeers, you know the difference between gross income and net income and turnover and revenue and EBITDA and all these terms, to be involved in the pricing, and then the sort of product element of it. Is it the right product, isn't it? What's the customer looking for? Where's the gap in the market? Can you still make money from it? You know, is it a complementary product or a main product? This is technical stuff. And then the whole distribution channel, who's making margin where, what happens if the supply chain doesn't work? Do you want to go direct to the consumer like we've seen brands like Dollar Shave Club do, where they've just actually skipped out the whole middle bit and gone direct to the consumer? Do you still want a retail model? So all these real pertinent questions. And then at the end of that long road, then you hit promotion. But I think too many people jump from A to promotion and say, oh, let's do an ad. And, you know, just ask yourself basic questions. Who are you talking to? What are your objectives? What's your positioning? What are you trying to say? You know, what are your objectives in financial terms? Because the other thing is that unless marketing can speak the language of the boardroom, which quite frankly is dollars and financial return, short-term or long-term, whatever that may be, then you're always going to have a problem. So it's an interesting question, which I think we have a lot of work to do as an industry, actually, in getting there. So,
Richard, have there been any game-changing moments for either you or the business?
Well, I think when I joined GE, so I joined GE, James, in 2003. We were acquired, actually. I was working for a business at the time called First National, which was a finance house. So if you went into, I don't know, a retailer and you bought a sofa for £1,000, you know, you can spread the payment over 12 months. We were effectively providing the finance, the loan for our consumer. And we got acquired by GE in 2003. And at the time, GE was the biggest company in the world. They were acquiring one business globally every 3 days. And we had 300,000 employees. So GE suddenly sort of swooped, took us over. We were a relatively small business. And the GE at that time was the bit, you know, when you say to people now, who do you want to work for? They say, oh, Microsoft or Apple or Google or Amazon or whoever it may be. At that time, most people said GE. So it was actually like going to a university every day, because the quality of people was like, you've never seen anything like this. Like you'd walk in and you just think, it's a bit like, to use a sort of football analogy, when a team signs a superstar and it raises the bar for everybody. when I joined GE, you just thought you better raise your game here, otherwise you're not going to last very long.
Are you the superstar in this story? Are you saying that GE signed you and you raised the bar of the whole of GE?
No, I'd love to be able to say that, James, but sadly, I'd suggest it may have been the other way around, right? I sort of came in and thought, I need to raise my game up. And what GE taught me was the importance of financial measurement and objectives and process and the right way to do stuff and the right way to look at stuff and measurement. And it seems a while ago, but they had Six Sigma at the time, which was based on Motorola actually brought it in. But the whole premise of Six Sigma was about reducing errors in what you did. And I remember we went to a class on this, and they said, how many aeroplanes are flying around the world? And I don't know what the number is, right? But it's sort of millions, over the course of a year. And how many accidents are there? It's very, very few. And that's because everything is precise and driven and got right. And it showed you could actually do it. So GE was this wonderful education in how to actually run a business commercially. And they just taught you how to, if you used to, what would be your elevator speech was a good GE term. So if you're in the elevator with the CEO and he said, what are you working on now? You had to be able to say the 3 things that would make a difference to the business. And it was very much output led rather than input led. So, you got to appraisal time and you couldn't write a whole thesis. Well, I've tried this and I did this and I worked hard at this. It was purely based on what difference did you make to the business in an output term. So it was just a really, really interesting time and a challenge, because my point at the beginning was you're not used to the corporate world. I certainly wasn't used to a world where you were going to be measured twice a year against your peers who were all unbelievably good in their own, in a very sort of subjective way. So it's that was an interesting time, but a real challenge, because again, I hadn't applied to join GE. They acquired us, and when history is written by the winners, right? When they acquire you, you fit into the way they want to do stuff, not the other way around. So that was an interesting.
But you took a lot of the way way they work. You've incorporated that and taken that with you with your career.
Yeah, because I think that there's lessons you probably learn from everywhere you work, but definitely the idea of the importance of processes, the importance of structure, the importance of long-term and short-term. And we also worked, I was in the GE Money division. We worked with a lot of big retailers and third parties at the time. And we would go into, say, one of the big ones, I think, we worked with like Debenhams and House of Fraser, these sort of huge brands. And you would go into a meeting with someone like a sort of Philip Green, etc., who we used to meet relatively regularly, maybe 4 times a year. And you had an hour with him. And, at the end of it, you had to assess, was that worthwhile for him and for you? And we used to have this sort of saying at GE that when you went into a third party, you had to know more about their business than they did, right? So if you went to see a CEO or a CFO or a CMO, we used to read the annual reports, go through the investor presentations, find out where that business was going, what they needed to do, what was driving them, and then mold our product around how we can help them get there. So it was very market orientated. It wasn't coming in and saying, hey, this is what GE does. It was, this is how GE can increase the revenue for your business. And it's a very subtle but important difference, because my point a while ago, if you can start talking that kind of language to the right people, suddenly you're a partner, and it's like, man, this guy can increase my profits by 1-2% a year. It makes a huge amounts of difference. So
turning a problem, providing your problem with suddenly a solution.
Yeah, and then you gain credibility and you gain trust, and suddenly it becomes not just about the product you supply, but about how the whole relationship piece works. So she was exceptionally good at that. So it's fascinating, right? And it's a lesson you can take anywhere you work.
So Richard, other than obviously the situation we're going through currently, I'm interested to hear what was the toughest period you went through and how did you kind of go about overcoming it?
I think that when I was with, actually, if you go back to my first national days, what I suggested was, that we provided point of sale finance. And the difficulty there is that you don't own your distribution channel at all, because people are coming into retailers, you're just providing the loan. And secondly, it's a commoditized market. What difference does it make to the consumer whether they're with us as First National or Hitachi Finance or however many other businesses that are out there? And I think there's a danger that when things become a commodity, that you actually can, you just become a number. Right? It's very hard to make yourself different. And as a marketeer, the whole idea is you sell a story of why you're different to anybody else. So what we did was, our parent company was Abbey or Santander in today's terms, was there a sort of cross-sell opportunity. So once you came in, Lucas, and had bought your sofa and, we had financed the £1,000, were there other financial needs that we could do for you? So were there savings account, were there bank accounts, were there mortgages? So that cross-sell opportunity. But I think what's interesting, well, now and then, I guess, is that you've got to handle cross-sell with care. We all get this, mail through the door that says, hey, do you want a new mortgage? And you think, no, not really, right? And if I did, it's probably 8 years away, so it's just a waste. And actually you can get to sort of brand annoyance relatively quickly. So one of the things we tried to do was really sort of understand, why the customer had taken out a loan. Was there anything else we could help them with? Was there an unsecured personal loan that may be at a better rate than what we're offering them now? So what you then do is start sort of building relationships. So I think a real difficulty we had at that time was moving away from a commodity, i.e. you're just one of 10 partners, and what difference does it make, to actually, I want to use them. And I think there's examples across financial services where people have done that. First Direct is the most famous one, parented by HSBC. So, but actually what First Direct do is say, look, we're going to offer this amazing service. We're going to be there 24/7. We'll help you. We'll look to say yes where we can. So I think in financial services, it's increasingly important to move away from we're just another supplier to actually we're going to offer you something that's more interesting. And then you look at other industries, trying to think Bulb, for example, in utilities. So I'm with Bulb for my gas and electricity, right? It's not something you think about very often, right? But actually they may well not be the cheapest, but that they wrote to me 6 months ago, say, hey, the price of gas has come down, therefore we're going to actually make your tariff cheaper. It's the first time anyone has ever written to me and said, we're going to make your tariff cheaper, right? So suddenly I immediately start trusting these people a little bit more. So I think that the hardest thing to do at the moment is actually to stand out. And actually you can look at big businesses that are going to have that struggle. Netflix would be a good example. So they've probably had 18 months to 2 years where they've been able to dominate that streaming market. Everyone loves them. Well, something called Disney Plus has suddenly come in and suddenly taken billions of customers, or Apple are going to get interested, or Amazon Prime is suddenly going to become much more serious. So it's actually an evolving element. And I think you normally have about 18 months where you can have a market relatively to yourself. And then suddenly you're going to have to differentiate and work on it. So it's not a challenge that I think has finished, but just an answer to your question, that was the first time we'd thought, how do we make ourselves different, but in a way that's really relevant to customer, not just us saying we're doing something for the sake of it.
I was just going to say, how are you adapting to this, to your strategy right now, and what measures are you putting into place to deal with the situation that we're currently going through?
I think that was the sort of practical piece that every business would talk about, of how they had to move people from a physical office to a home environment. And thankfully, we were pretty much set up to do that. So everyone suddenly managed to work from home relatively quickly and efficiently with absolutely no drop in the service at all. From a sort of customer point of view, or from a personal point of view, it hasn't been very different, actually. I'd only just joined the business, incidentally, when lockdown began. So I was a little bit fortunate. I had a sort of first few days in the office, and then suddenly I was home working, so that hasn't changed too much. From a business point of view, I talked initially about the need 24/7. People can speak to us and have, what we call an OF expert at hand to talk about the currency market. And that hasn't changed. I guess, James, it's just a case of re-emphasising that and saying to people, if you need to speak to someone, or you want to speak to someone, whether that be 1 a.m. or 6 p.m. or Sydney time or London time, we follow the sun in effect. So we go from the UK to the US to Australia, and it literally is 24/7. So I think it's just emphasising that, because now more than ever in uncertain times, I think people just need a little bit of human contact and interaction and reassurance, and we're certainly doing that. And I wonder, I just think people probably need that more than ever now. So just as a business, we're fortunate as a business that we can fall back to our core values and our core offering, and say it's probably needed more than ever in these times. So hopefully if people need to use our services, they'll find that a pretty reassuring part of our offering.
What about your clients? How are they kind of adapting their plans?
Well, it's difficult, Lucas, to know what's going to happen, of course. I mean, anyone who's got a crystal ball that can with certainty say this is where we're all going to be in a year's time, I think is probably doing much better than I am. So I think from a sort of client point of view, that there's a lot of questions. What you can do, though, is sort of try and educate yourself as much as you can to what may happen. So if you look at, the big events we've got coming up in the UK, you've got the release of lockdown. What will that mean? You've got the furlough scheme theoretically coming to an end in October. What will that mean? You've got the reopening of leisure, of retail. What does that mean? You've got Brexit negotiations, which we've almost forgotten about, but are still, it's still going to happen. Are we going to leave at the end of the year with a deal, without a deal? What does that mean to me? So I think there's a lot of questions. And, I had a quote this morning that, no one takes out insurance when their house is on fire. And I think that's a really good quote for the current times. I would just be prepared. And I think that the key thing is not to have the answers, because I think, quite frankly, it's okay to say I don't know, because I think it's very difficult to predict exactly where it's going to be. What I think is important is to ask these questions and say, well, as a business, how is that going to impact me? And can I mitigate against it? So, certainly OFX on that side of it is there to go through those questions with people and discuss it. But wider than that, I think all of us as individuals, whatever business we're in, need to be looking at this and saying, well, there's a plan A and a plan B and a plan C, and depending where all this goes, then we need to put it in. The worst thing you can do is, I think, just wait to see what happens and go along with it. I would urge anyone, actually, just really give it some good thought, because none of us know. I was watching a sort of business documentary about how businesses plan generally in good times. It's actually in good times you can prepare also for the bad times with a strong balance sheet and just making sure that the business is sustainable, because this is challenging. But I do see businesses adapting, right? I mean, you see very small businesses doing really, really good stuff, and businesses, little cafes that would traditionally sit in and now becoming takeaways, and businesses, suddenly saying, well, we'll deliver to people's homes, and suddenly there's a demand for it. So,
yeah, these are the times that innovation happens. Some of the best businesses in the world were created during recessions, and it's about it makes businesses more reactive, doesn't it? And how they can change, and pushes them more into those areas that they potentially should have looked at previously.
I agree, and it's often the smaller businesses that actually have an advantage here, because you have flexibility. You can make decisions sort of relatively quickly, and just think of a different way of doing it. Turn it around and think, well, what does the consumer want? So what the consumer probably wants now is, home delivery, for example. That's important. Or they need, something that's quick, or something that's fresh and good for you, because maybe people aren't going to the gym as often as they could do. Whatever it may be. Or they need, streaming services on their TV, or they need their broadband to be as quick as it could be, because now you have 3 people working from home when it used to be 1. And I think it would be the businesses that can see it at that level and think, let's just adapt the times and be really useful, because I also don't think the consumer will forget who helped them. So there's a bit of a loyalty play there as well, that actually you can get somewhere. So if I was running a little cafe at the moment, I would definitely be trying to do home deliveries as much as I could, expand my range a little bit, think about it, and there may be an opportunity that becomes the business model of the future rather than what it was, and you can lead that.
And as well, how you can enrich those relationships with the customers, like as you were kind of saying earlier, similar situation with Admiral the other day. They just sent me an email out of nowhere saying every single one of their customers, they're going to send £40 into their bank account, just because people haven't been driving their cars as much. And it's something small, but something like that will make you really, stick with them, and just kind of really respect something like that, and really enrich those relationships.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think there's a real opportunity for businesses out there to actually, you just got to think quite creatively about it. And you've also got to be relatively quick, because by the time everyone else is doing it, it might be a little bit late. But if you can get in quickly and be the sort of first first bunch to say, actually, we've sort of flexed our model, we've looked at things differently, I think there's a really good chance to make a few inroads, actually.
But as you say, it's about putting yourself in the shoes of the customer and understanding what their needs are, not what you think you'd like their needs to be, and that's a big difference.
It's a huge difference. And actually, one of the things I teach people now when I'm talking to them is, when you join a business, you sign a really nice contract, but you lose any right to think like a customer, because you're not a customer anymore. In fact, you're quite biased away from being a customer. You're the opposite. You're seeing it from a company point of view. So James, you're absolutely right. The importance of market orientation and seeing it from the customer's point of view is so crucial.
Yeah, but that takes you back to Swiss Cottage, right? And that experience that you got there serves you well. So how do you stay positive in times like these, Richard?
Well, I'm quite fortunate, James, actually on a personal level, because I have a family. It's allowed me to spend a little bit more time with them and two young daughters that I have. We have a garden. So I think one has to look actually at what you have rather than what you don't have. And there's a lot of people in a sort of far worse situation. I think actually to some extent you can also look at it with a degree of detachment and fascination. You are actually living through a period of history that will be taught in textbooks in 100 years' time, and you will be part of it. My kids who are young and at 5 and 8 will be teaching their kids, who will say, well, what did you do during this time, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a bit of fascination from an economic point of view, a sort of social point of view. But I actually think, James, that a little bit of humbleness is no bad thing. And I just think compared to so many people, I'm in such a fortunate position that you just say, maybe just be a bit grateful for that and just hope it works out for everyone who's not quite so fortunate.
Love that. So, I mean, we kind of touched on it. You gave some great advice a moment ago, but is there anything else in terms of advice you may have for businesses during these times?
Well, I would just say to everyone, right, be curious, be interested, read a lot, educate yourself a lot, see what everyone else is doing. But my number one bit of advice is don't think you've got to have all the answers, because I just don't think anyone has the answers, right? I think the key is to look at the question, as I said earlier, from an external point of view, see what you can do to make things easier for your consumers, and just accept that there's times of uncertainty. And I think it, generally speaking, will be the people that accept it is what it is. How do we navigate our way through it? Will do much better than the people who sort of are a little bit in denial and thinking, well, it's going to go back to normal, because I don't know what normal is going to look like. So it's an interesting point that when people say, well, I'm going to go back to an office in 6 months' time, you may well not be going to the same office you left behind, when there could be fundamental changes to that. Or I'm going to go back and watch a football match. Well, maybe not with 80,000 other people you're not, right? So I think it's an interesting idea that years and years and years ago, I sort of heard this quote that, the best way to cope with change is to help create it. And I would argue that pretty much exists really strongly today. Is I wouldn't yearn for what we had. I would sort of look forward and say, well, what's it going to be going forward? Because some things will remain the same, some things will be different, but there's also a little bit of fascination to how that will all play out. And if you can keep curious and fascinated by it, it's quite a nice mindset to have.
And what impact do you think this will have on your market?
Well, I think people generally, from a sort of business point of view, may look at, if you look at the sort of economic situation at the moment, it's very drastic. The NASDAQ is at an all-time high, and the US economy, has sort of huge unemployment and very uncertainty. So you've got this sort of detachment from two economic strands that are happening. So, and you have very cheap borrowing going on. Interest rates in this country are 0.1%. So actually, access to money is still easy enough. What would be interesting is in sort of 6, 9, 12 months, as we talked about before, when the government intervention pulls back a little bit and people sort of find it tougher. So I don't know in the short term, James, whilst people can still access money, there's going to be huge amounts of difference. I think when things become tougher, the furlough scheme ends. But if I could take one lesson from it for any business, the people we work with and others, is be prepared, because I think we learned that in the global financial crisis, that things can happen, and the importance of having a strong balance sheet, the importance of not overextending yourselves during the sort of good times, the importance that realizing that things are cyclical. We've just had a longest ever bull market in the stock market, so people probably feel quite wealthy as a result of that. And then suddenly something comes out of the blue. I mean, we're now, sort of halfway through the year, more or less. 6 months ago, this was an unthinkable situation. So in a really, really short space of time, suddenly look at what we've been through. I mean, it's remarkable. So I do think if anything is going to change, it'll be people will think, the good times won't be taken for granted. There'll always be that provision of what happens in the bad times. But on the other hand, and it's an interesting conversation perhaps for another time, I was talking to someone yesterday about what will change and what won't change. And, humanity has survived, a long, long time. And fundamentally, a lot hasn't changed in that time. So whether we'll look back on this period as a blip and everything will eventually, habits won't change in the long term, I don't know. But I do think for those that have lived through it, I do think being a little bit more cautious and prepared for, any change out the blue might be something that you think about. I mean, if I was running a small business, it would certainly teach me a lesson, or any business, it would certainly teach me a lesson that, the world can change. Look at the travel industry, look at the cruise industry. If we were sitting here 6 months ago saying what's going to have a really good 2020, and you'd say, I don't know, the cruise industry is going to have a really good one because generations are getting older, people like cruises, it's a great way to see the world, you can be together forever, be together, on the ship for a long time, you can get, no one would have argued with you. So that's a really, really good call. 6 months later, the cruise industry is
so
huge
just
amounts of issues.
Not being comfortable, isn't it? But yeah, Richard, that's amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I think that's pretty much everything from James and I. Do you have any links or anything that you want us to put in the description to your pages?
No, I'm slightly losing my internet connection here, despite me saying it was important to have good broadband earlier. But no, not really. I mean, obviously I have a sort of LinkedIn profile that people can go to if they so wish to, but that's probably as far and wide as I am.
Well, from Richard, James and I, that's another episode of Bang for Your Business. Please, if this was of any use, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Spotify, give it a like, share. Thank you so much, guys. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one. Cheers.